All right. So, in talking about organisms maintaining homeostasis, we talked about living things need to take in nutrients. They need to transport those nutrients around. They need to remove waste. Now we're moving into how living organisms respond. So all organisms, whether it's a single cell bacteria or a human, have to respond to signals from the outside, from inside of the organism, and they do that in a couple ways. One way is through nerve control, which is offers usually a quicker response, but sometimes a shorter term response, or through chemical means, which are often slower, but sometimes longer lasting. So there's different ways, and we'll talk about each of those in turn. So today we're going to focus on nervous control. So if we think about simple organisms, like a protist, like this euglena, do they have a nervous system? Me? What? Why not?
Because they don't have like nerves or
Yeah, they don't have systems at all. Like they're a single cell. So they don't have a nervous system or even nerve tissues or nerve cells, but they do have nervous control using different structures other than those. So they don't have a true nervous system, they don't have true neurons, but they have structures that act in a similar way. For example, this euglena has that orange eye spot. It's not an eye, it can't see anything, it has no brain, but this structure inside of the euglena is sensitive to light, and the euglena can use that information to know which direction to swim to get to light so it can go through photosynthesis. So that's one means. Other protists are sensitive to pH, okay, or oxygen or food. So they do have some means of taking in information and coordinating their response. For a paramecium, with all those cilia around the outside, there has to be coordination for them all to move in the right pattern in order to allow it to swim in a certain direction. If they're all just moving randomly, it wouldn't make its way to where it needs to go. So there is nervous control even in very simple organisms. As we move up to animals, the hydra, for example. A hydra doesn't have a central nervous system. It has this other structure that's called its nerve net. It's sort of a decentralized nervous system. So there's no brain, there's no spinal cord or anything like that. It just has these neurons all interconnecting. It can use that nerve net to do pretty complex tasks. It can use those tentacles to grab on to and kill its prey, to put that prey into its mouth, okay, and then to ingest that waste after digestion has happened. So it can coordinate all those activities using this sort of nerve net rather than a central nervous system like other animals. An earthworm. Earthworms have a central nervous system. It's pretty simple. An earthworm has a very simple sort of brain. It's more of like an enlargement of the top of the spinal cord, more than a brain, but it's sort of the beginnings of the evolution of a brain. And so from this brain, there is a nerve cord, similar to a spinal cord, which goes down the belly side of the earthworm. So when you think about vertebrates, like humans, we have a dorsal nerve cord. Our nerve cord runs down our back through our vertebrae. These organisms, the earthworm and grasshopper, they have a ventral nerve cord. Their main nerve cord is on the belly side. Branching off are the nerves that go to various muscles and so forth. The earthworm doesn't have good senses, doesn't have eyes or ears or taste or anything like that, but it does have some cells on its skin that are sensitive to light, that are sensitive to sound. So it does have some information coming in, allowing it to know, where to go, how to burrow through the ground, and so forth. The grasshopper has a more advanced nervous system. Okay? It's similar in some ways to the earthworm, but a more advanced brain. The brain of insects is larger than that of the annelids. Has much better information coming into the grasshopper than the earthworm. So grasshoppers can smell using receptors on their antennae. Grasshoppers can see. Okay? They have compound eyes to take in information. They can hear. They have a tympanum, outer eardrum. They have hairs that are sensitive to touch. They have palps in their mouth that are sensitive to taste. So they have all of these senses. They have a lot more information coming in to their brain that they have to process. They also have this ventral nerve cord running down the belly side with nerves branching off from that. We're going to spend most of our time talking about humans, however. So humans have a highly developed nervous system, which includes the brain and the spinal cord. Those are the central nervous system. We have that dorsal nerve cord. It goes down our back, protected by our vertebrae. Extra what? Soap. Please don't use it all up. Thank you. So the impulses travel along pathways of our neurons, our nerve cells. We have well-developed sensory receptors. We can take in a lot of information from the outside environment. And our nervous system helps regulate and control conditions inside and outside of our body along with our hormones. So this is our central nervous system, the brain, and then the attached spinal cord. We'll talk about some vocab we need when we're talking about the nervous system. So information coming into the nervous system are called stimuli, okay? Often taking in through special receptors. And receptors are the specialized structures that can take in information. Receptors that can take in light, touch, sound, taste, and so forth. As information comes in, stimuli come into these receptors. They are then transferred to the central nervous system by...
He said it's not me. Thanks.
Wow.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So these sensory nerves take this information to the central nervous system through these nerve impulses, these signals that are transferred from one neuron to another. And then, if necessary, the central nervous system can respond, can send out some sort of response. If it's, for example, movement, motor neurons carry this message out to special cells called effectors, which respond to that stimulus. So this is a nerve cell. So the nerve cells, or neurons as we call them, have a unique structure. This doesn't look like a typical cell. When we were studying cells and you drew an animal cell, this is not what you probably drew. Different types of cells have different structures, different shapes, depending on their function. So this is a neuron. And we'll label the parts and talk about what they do. So these sort of branches, they are listening in for messages from receptors or from other nerve cells. Those branches are called the dendrites. They're connected to the main body of the neuron, which is called the cell body. It contains organelles, it contains the nucleus, it's filled with cytoplasm. And then there is this elongated section of the neuron. That elongated section is called the axon of the nerve. It conducts nerve impulses down that axon. At the end are these branches. They're called the terminal branches, and they end in these synaptic nodes. this individual neuron, which is in purple, is also surrounded by these other cells. These are specialized cells called Schwann cells. And these Schwann cells produce this fatty substance that builds up, that's what you see in yellow, that kind of insulates the axon. Just like wires, in your house, they have the conducting part, the copper, but then surrounding them is insulation. That's kind of like what this myelin sheath does. It's really important to how the nerve cell functions. And it has these gaps between those myelin sheaths as well. And so nerve impulses are transferred from one end of the neuron down to the other. And then they can be passed on to another neuron, okay, to a muscle cell, right, to a variety of other structures. And so let's talk about how that information actually passes down the neuron. So it happens using an electrical impulse, basically. So in the typical conditions in the neuron, the inside of the neuron and the axon is negatively charged, and the outside is positively charged. The cell keeps it this way by using active transport of potassium and sodium to maintain this, this membrane potential. When a nerve impulse is going to be sent down the axon, okay, what happens is things change. Special sodium channels open up. Sodium moves into the neuron, causing the charge to temporarily change and switch. So what you'll notice, these positive charges switch to the inside, and then that continues down the axon, sending the nerve impulse to the end of the axon. After that happens, it quickly changes back to its original conditions, okay? And then that nerve impulse has been sent all the way down to the axon, to the terminal branches. Okay? That's how these nerve impulses get sent. It happens very quickly. Okay? It's about 300 miles per hour is how quickly these nerve impulses are sent around our body. And it's also one of the reasons why an electrical shock can be dangerous, because being shocked with electricity interferes with how our neurons function, because they work based on this electrical gradient between the inside and outside of the cell. Electrical shock interferes with that. So once this nerve impulse has traveled down the axon and got to the end, well, then there's a gap. Neurons do not physically connect to each other. There's a gap between the terminal branches of one neuron and the dendrites of the next neuron. So how does the signal pass from one neuron to another? Well, it happens using a chemical signal. It happens using what are called neurotransmitters. They've heard about neurotransmitters before. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that are released from the terminal branches, those synaptic bulbs of one neuron. They're released into the synapse, this space, this gap between neurons. They bind then to special receptors that are on the dendrite of the next neuron, which then initiate the nerve impulse in this neuron, which would continue on. So the signal goes from first an electrical signal down to the end of the neuron, then it jumps this gap, the synapse, using this chemical signal of neurotransmitters. There are different types of neurotransmitters. For example, acetylcholine is one. This is the neurotransmitter that's released when our neurons tell our muscles to contract. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that interacts with our muscle cells, activating them. And then there are other chemicals, enzymes, which break down those neurotransmitters to stop that response. So that's how neurons work. And our whole nervous system is made of collections of these neurons. Our central nervous system, our brain and spinal cord, are huge collections of millions and millions of these neurons interconnected in certain ways. So that's what the brain is. It's a massive neurons located, protected by the skull, by the cranium. And our brain is surrounded by these membranes. They're called the meninges. Does that look familiar at all? You ever heard of?
I think I've heard it very close.
Meningitis. We'll talk about that in a minute. Meningitis is an inflammation of these membranes. They have fluid trapped between them, which helps to cushion our brain, so that when we move around, our brain isn't smashing into the side of our cranium. It's cushioned by this fluid. Now, a severe enough blow to the head can cause damage to the brain, but it's reduced by this fluid that's in between those layers. And when we look at the brain, it has different parts to it. Probably if you imagine a brain, you're probably thinking of the cerebrum, this largest portion of the brain, the part that has all of those folds in it. So the cerebrum is the center of voluntary activity. It's where sensory information is taken in and processed, sight, smell, touch, learning. It's where we initiate motor movement. It's where memory is stored. It's where intelligence, emotions, thinking, learning, speech, sort of all of the things you think about probably as being controlled by your brain, those are all part of the functioning of the cerebrum. It's split into a right and a left hemisphere. See this cleft down the middle? And different parts of the brain are responsible for different activities. We'll talk about that in a minute. So that's the cerebrum. Then at the base of the cerebrum is this other section, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is an area of the brain that helps coordinate activity, especially motor activity, helps maintain balance. That's controlled here from the cerebellum. And then there is this section here. It's really the top of the spinal cord or the base of the brain. It's called the brainstem or the medulla oblongata. And this is the part that's responsible for some of the key activities that keep us alive. For example, our heartbeat, our blood pressure, reflexes, coughing, blinking. All of those activities are controlled by the brainstem. And this is why you may have heard the term brain dead. So what does that term mean? If you've ever heard of somebody's been in a severe accident or had a severe illness, you may have heard that it's said that they're brain dead.
So all of their like essential functions of the hunger,
Yes. So what that means, you're exactly right, is that the functioning of the cerebrum, so memory, thought, speech, is not functioning. There's no activity in the cerebrum. However, the brainstem is still working, and therefore the key activities keeping them technically alive are still working. Their heart is still beating. They probably have a ventilator that's breathing for them. But those key things, their blood pressure is still being regulated and so forth. And so they're alive in that way, that they're physically alive. However, there's no activity here in the other parts of the brain that we think of actually somebody's personality. If we look at another view of the brain from the side, we have here the cerebrum, cerebellum, the brainstem. There's also this sort of space at the core of the brain. In that core, there's fluid. There's also some important glands of our endocrine system that connect our nervous system to our endocrine system. Okay, that's here, in the middle of the brain. And you'll see that different types of organisms have different proportions of the cerebrum to the cerebellum to the brainstem. In fish, for example, the cerebrum is quite small. It's actually smaller than the cerebellum and the brainstem, which are the light pink portions. And you can see how that varies in these different types of vertebrates. In mammals, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. And in humans, it's quite large compared to the other parts. We know that different sections of the brain are responsible for different functions. Okay, for example, this front area of the brain is what's associated with logic, and movement is initiated by this rear part of the brain, and vision and language. So scientists have started mapping out function to section of the brain for a long time. And initially they did that by looking at people that have had brain injuries. If a person has an injury to a section of their brain, what people would do is then observe, okay, well, if a person damages this section of the brain over here, well, how does that affect them? Do they lose their speech? And they started putting together this sort of map of the brain by looking at how damage to the brain affected different functioning. Now there's also more modern tools, something like a functional MRI. So you may have gotten an MRI in a part of your body before. They have a special type of MRI in which people do certain activities while their brains are being scanned. And scientists then look at what parts of the brain are active when a person is singing, or when they're speaking, or when they are doing physical activity, and they can look at which parts of the brain are active to sort of trace and make this map of the brain even more accurate. So from the base of our brain, we have our spinal cord, which runs down through our vertebrae, and branching off from the spinal cord are the peripheral nerves, the nerves that go to all the different parts of our body, taking information back and forth. So all the nerves located outside of the brain and spinal cord are called the peripheral nervous system. They run throughout our body. And so these nerves branch off from the spinal cord. As we go lower on the spinal cord, those peripheral nerves control activity lower on our body. So for example, the nerves that branch off at the very top of our spinal cord, called the cervical nerves up at the top, they control the movement of our head and our neck. They control the functioning of our diaphragm and our arms and our wrists and our hands. Then the next set are called the thoracic nerves. They control movement in our torso, okay, this central section. Then our lumbar nerves down in the lower back. They control our leg muscles and take in information from our legs. And then the sacral nerves down near the tailbone control the lower functions. And so sometimes a person has an injury to their spinal cord. Spinal cords are unlike bone or muscle or skin. They don't regenerate. They don't heal. So if a person severs their spinal cord, it typically does not heal back. And so when a person gets a spinal cord injury, where that injury happens is very important. If a person damages their spinal cord down here, okay, they may lose the use of parts of their legs. Because what's happening is the message from their brain telling their legs to move starts in the brain, travels down the spinal cord, but it gets to the damaged area and it can't go any further. So the message telling their leg muscles to move doesn't actually get to their leg muscles, and so they can't move their legs. At the same time, they would lose feeling because touching their leg, the information starts traveling through the nerves, but it gets to that damage and it can't go any further. So that information never actually gets to the brain, telling them that there's this sensation. And so as we move higher up the spinal cord, there's a loss of more and more functions. If a person has a spinal cord injury really high, that's when they have a loss of more abilities. A spinal cord injury way up high in the neck is when a person might lose the use of both their arms and their legs, and even their diaphragm. They might have to breathe using a ventilator because they've damaged their spinal cord above this C4 vertebrae. So damage to the spinal cord interferes with everything that's controlled below it. The nerves that control voluntary response, that branch out, they're called somatic nerves. The nerves that control involuntary response are called autonomic nerves. And different types of nerves control different parts. We also have built-in reflexes, which are protective. So a reflex is when information is not required to go all the way to the brain and back to have a response. If you put your finger, you touch something sharp, or you touch something hot, you immediately pull it away before you've even comprehended that you touched something hot or something sharp. That's a protective reflex. And the reason it happens so quickly is because we have these reflex arcs where we have sensory neurons bring this information into the spinal cord, and then there's this connection right back out to a motor neuron connected to our muscles. And so that message doesn't need to get to our brain for us to pull our hand away. It loops through our spinal cord and right back out, so that can happen very, very quickly. So if you ever touch something really hot, you've pulled your hand away, and then you start to think about it after. Like, oh, that's really hot. Oh, now that's starting to hurt, because it's taking some time for that information then to get to your brain. If you had to do that whole process before you removed your hand, you would be doing a lot more damage. If you had to first feel that this thing's really hot, then you had to think and tell your muscles to move, that would take more time, it would do more damage. So the last thing we'll talk about are some malfunctions, some diseases of the nervous system. And for probably many of these you've heard of. Some you may know people affected by some of these. So cerebral palsy, this is one in which there has been damage to the brain at some point early on in development, either in utero, during development, or soon after birth. And parts of the brain have been damaged, and this typically leads to poor coordination, problems with movement, motor function, problems with speech, maybe tremors, certain parts of the body being paralyzed. And depending on which part of the brain has been damaged, determines which symptoms, which effects are present. And scientists aren't really sure about what causes various types of cerebral palsy. They just know that it happens. And once those parts of the brain are damaged, there's no cure. You can't bring them back in any way. Typically, a person with cerebral palsy may have therapy to help improve their movement and their coordination or their speech, but there's actually no cure to take those symptoms away. We mentioned earlier meningitis. Meningitis is caused by a bacteria or a virus that gets into the lining of the brain and that fluid. And as that infection takes hold, it leads to swelling, which puts pressure on the brain tissue and can cause it to become damaged. If a person has bacterial meningitis, they can take an antibiotic to help cure it. There's also viral meningitis. You can be vaccinated for it. In fact, most of the times, a lot of colleges require a meningitis vaccination. Some don't. It's not a sort of routine vaccination for most people. But you can be vaccinated against certain types of meningitis. A stroke. A stroke is caused when there's a loss of blood flow to a part of the brain for a time, leading to that part of the brain being damaged. It can be due to a blood clot, which stops the flow of blood to a certain area. That's this ischemic stroke. Or it can be due to hemorrhaging, bleeding in the brain, so the blood is leaking out and not going to the part of the brain it's supposed to go to. Okay. And when there's a lack of blood flow to the brain, then that can lead to long-term damage. And so if there's prolonged lack of blood flow, then there may be the loss of function, whatever part of the brain was damaged, the associated function would be interfered with. Polio, disease that used to affect millions of people, but doesn't anymore. Because what do we have? Vaccines. So vaccination, we're all vaccinated against polio. Nowadays, nobody gets polio. It used to affect millions of people. Who had polio? Famous person, but hid it. Yeah, FDR had polio, but hid it from the public.
What's your opinion on anti-vax?
Vaccinations have saved billions of lives and will continue to do so, and therefore we should all be vaccinated. That's my.
I knew the was going to be
That's Sasha.
tomorrow.
So some other neurological illness, muscular sclerosis, is caused when that lining, that insulation around the neurons breaks down, and it can lead to the malfunctioning of those neural pathways. It can lead to loss of control, muscular control, problems with sensory input as well. Parkinson's disease is caused by a lack of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. And the symptoms of Parkinson's disease are tremors, difficulty in motor activity, and so forth. There's drugs that can help treat Parkinson's and help reduce the tremors and so forth, but not actually cure it. There's no cure yet. Alzheimer's disease. This is what my grandmother had. My grandmother died of Alzheimer's. It's due to the slow, typically degeneration of neurons, especially those associated with memory. So a person with Alzheimer's loses control of, somebody may have dementia, confusion, and also loss of memory. For example, my grandmother, she would forget her kids' names or even a conversation they had 5 minutes ago, but at the same time, like, she could remember stories from 60 or 70 years ago when she was a child. So the way that those memories are sort of eroded over time is sort of interesting. There's no known cure for Alzheimer's either. Epilepsy is caused by the sort of random firing of neurons resulting in seizures. And sometimes those seizures are what you might imagine, convulsions. Or sometimes they're small seizures where a person, you might not even notice that a person's having this seizure. They may just look like they're slowly falling asleep or something like that. So there's medications, anti-epileptic medications that can help reduce that. And the causes of epilepsy can be varied. So here you see some pictures showing the healthy brain versus Alzheimer's at the end. You can see the degeneration of that brain tissue. Okay, here you see that muscular sclerosis, the breakdown of that sheath that helps insulate those neurons, and then the random firing of those neurons leading to epilepsy. All right, tomorrow we're going to watch some of these videos about various neurological conditions, and we'll move on.